This is Craig Huston, your Summit Series host. Welcome to our podcast. The Summit Series is your behind-the-scenes pass to building real value and preparing for what's next, whether that's scaling, selling, or simply stepping back and enjoying what you've already built. Let's dive into what actually drives great outcomes and how you can make them happen. Well, hey, everybody. Thank you for joining us on the Summit Series. As my guest today, I have Wes Shelton. He's Managing Director for SM2 Advisors. He joined SM2 in 2011, and he's the guy that manages the day-to-day operations of the firm. He plays a pivotal role in every aspect of the deal-making process and provides his clients with a broad base of business experiences and a strong background in finance, real estate, and transactional analysis, managing hundreds of transactions nationally and internationally. And before coming to SM2 Advisors, he served a vital role in the competitive oil and gas industry. He helped launch and grow Lear Energy from a virtual unknown to a thriving E&P enterprise that sold for over $2.5 billion in 2008. Wes earned his bachelor's degree from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and an MBA in finance from the H. Wayne Huizinga School of Business at Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. He served on numerous nonprofit boards, including the Hart Gallery of Broward County, where he was chairman from 2009 to 2012. He also hosts his own podcast, Like a Champion, where he interviews successful business owners and entrepreneurs from all around the country. So, Wes, thank you so much for joining us today. Appreciate you taking the time to be here with us on the Summit Series.
Thanks for having me, Craig. I'm excited to dive in.
Well, let's do that. Wes, you and I have talked several times, and life can be super confusing just in general, but for sure when you're a business owner. And when it comes to making decisions, oftentimes we have several options. I remember when my son Matt was younger, he worked at a Cheesecake Factory. And if you've ever eaten a Cheesecake Factory, that menu is insane. Not only did he have to memorize that menu, but they had to memorize all the ingredients of every entree as well as the drink menu. So it was quite the effort. And one of the things I didn't like going there for was all of the choices. Give me a simple menu, a couple of things to choose from, can be overwhelming. But listen, in your space and my space, when we're talking to business owners who are either getting their business ready to sell, transition, or just trying to make it better, there's a lot of choices out there. In your space in particular, you'll hear people throw around terms like business brokers, M&A advisors, investment bankers. So I guess I have a compound question for you. First, I guess, what's the difference between each of those options? And second, how does a business owner know which one of those to choose? Like, where do I go if I'm a business owner and I'm thinking about selling my business? And then tell us a little bit about where your firm fits into that.
Yeah, sure. That's a good question, Craig, and one that we get very often. So if you think about the ecosystem of what I would call brokers or intermediaries, right? I would think of it as three different levels, where most of your Main Street businesses that would sell, call it $1 million or less or thereabouts, restaurants, dry cleaners, salons, things like that, those businesses would typically hire a business broker. That is a type of advisor that is most common in that space. And that you think of it more in terms of what's the most appropriate process for the owner or the seller. A business owner may have, in many cases, buyers if they specialize in that space, but they're usually going to, as part of their marketing strategy, put that listing out there online somewhere and wait for buyer inquiries to come in, much like you would in a real estate transaction. And the reason for that is because of that size, you're not really going to attract large strategic buyers like publicly traded companies or M&A or private equity firms. So a business broker is typically the intermediary that you would see for a smaller business, what we would call small business or Main Street or what have you. Above that level would be kind of where we would reside as an M&A advisory firm. So think of it as the lower middle market, which depends on who you ask what that size is, but I would say starting at $5 million in enterprise value and going up to, let's say, 100. And that's obviously a wide range, but it's not really considered small business, right? But it's not a large business. And so in that space, there are brokers that might swim in that space and seek listings that way and get some listings. But for the most part, in that space, especially on the lower end, it's thinner waters, I'd say. So that is where we really operate the most, is that lower middle market space, above the 5 million, below the 100 million. Most investment banks, which we'll get to in a minute, wouldn't go below 100 million, and many even below 50 million at all, right?
Okay.
So the large Goldmans and Morgan Stanleys of the world, many of them do not go below that $100 million threshold. It's just too small for them. The more boutique investment banks probably would dip down to like the $50 million range. So, we feel very comfortable that we serve a market that's, perhaps underserved in some ways, but the way we act is that we act as a fiduciary to the seller. So we really only represent sellers of businesses and have done very little buy work, and there's exceptions to every rule, right? But for the most part, we are exclusive to the seller and operate in this lower middle market. And so, as I mentioned earlier, 50 million, 100 million and more, that's investment bank, FINRA regulated, licensed, and investment banks, in addition to selling businesses, they are able to perform a number of other services as well, such as raising debt, raising equities, taking companies public, et cetera, where M&A advisors and business brokers were really not permitted to do those kinds of things.
Okay. And thank you for that clarification. When I talk to people in the industry, some of the investment bankers, even some M&A advisors, instead of a revenue number or a market value number, will say, we only serve customers with a minimum of 2.5 million in EBITDA or some other number. For a business owner, how do they really decide who they call?
Yeah, so I think that it really should focus more around the process. Who has expertise in selling businesses like mine, and what kind of process are they going to run? Many business owners are very sensitive about confidentiality, right? Discretion. So are you going to take my business and just paste it out there over BizBuySell and DealStream and your personal, your brokerage website and wait for the phone to ring? Or are you going to run your process like we do, which, yes, is a selling point of ours? We're much more discreet in how we sell businesses. So we will create a bespoke list of buyers that comes as a result of extensive market research and the various different channels that we have. And then we will reach out to those buyers directly and only engage them. So really, this is not a private placement with one buyer, and it's not a broad auction process. It's really a controlled process that's somewhere in between both of those two things that I mentioned. So it's calculated, but at the same time, we believe that it gives a good sort of market test of getting out there and reaching multiple buyers and created a competitive bidding in sort of deal heat is the term that we use. But I think as a business owner, you really want to focus on what's the process and how is this advisor going to market my business and help ensure that we have the best possible outcome. Now that outcome could be a lot of different things, right? It's not necessarily price. Price is always going to be an important factor. But if you're asking the right questions of business owners, you're able to uncover that. And a lot of times it's more about legacy. It's more about sustainability with the key employees, staying on with the business and even, sort of the ethics and how they run the business, right? So, the seller should be very clear on what their expectations are, specifically what are their goals, what is an optimal outcome for them in this transition process. Do they want to sell it to a third party? Do they want to transition it to key management, to family, or all of the employees via ESOP? So it's all about the process and really the pedigree of the parties that you're talking to and considering to represent you through the most important financial decision of your life
Yeah.
in most cases.
Yeah, and you just touched on something important, right? Not every end game is the same for every business owner, right? You can have internal transactions, you can have external transactions. I find when we start working with businesses, they start getting all of the things in place that create a very valuable business. The owner actually finds out that they're actually in love with their business again, right? That they realize why they started it in the first place, and now that
Yeah.
everything's actually working well, they'll decide to keep it for a
And maybe
longer
they're not
period of
chained
time.
to it anymore, right?
Yeah.
They've trained and hired competent management, so that frees them up to move around in the world and enjoy some travel and holidays and private time. And now all of a sudden there's a balance there that did not exist before, right?
Yeah, I think most of business owners can't imagine going on vacation without their cell phone and their laptop on almost 24/7, checking in on emails and text messages and kind of keeping their pulse on the business. It'd be nice to be able to just fully disengage. So,
Yeah.
yeah, so what are some of the options? You just kind of breeze through those a little bit, maybe circle back and take a minute to touch on each one, the internal types of transactions like an ESOP or a management buyout or an external transition where it might be a third party buyer. It might be an investment banker, a P&E firm, that private equity firm that comes and wants to do something because they're building something bigger to sell.
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the options?
Yeah, so starting at the top, I would say a strategic option, right? Businesses that do what you do, but are bigger than you and acquisitive, and publicly traded firms or firms that are privately capitalized. Uh, and again, do what you do, and they tend to be the best buyers in terms of value. But even I would say what a strategic firm is these days, it's almost like a little blurry, right? Because you find a lot of these privately owned firms, they may have been strategic in nature originally, but now they're backed by private equity, right? So they're almost a private equity firm masquerading as a strategic buyer, but ultimately the strategic is one that is usually from a value standpoint and a complete exit standpoint optimal for the seller to consider if they're looking to transition out completely. Private equity would be sort of the next level. And there's roughly 8,000 private equity firms in the US, trillions of dollars in dry powder. So very, very active. And oftentimes they start by acquiring what we would call a platform investment. So if they have an investment thesis in a certain industry, right, they'll go out and they'll buy a company that meets that criteria in a geography that they want to be in, and then we'll do what's called add-on or tuck-in acquisitions around that. So the platform is one that they're looking for talent in addition to the ongoing concern, right? So in that case, private equity is undesirable in the sense that they typically would require sellers to roll some equity and stay in. They want to leverage your knowledge and your experience, which isn't just for growth factors, right? It's also for minimizing risk of the business. Why am I, as a private equity buyer, to think that I can run your business any better than you can? All I'm looking to do is leverage your knowledge and the connections that you've made and the growth and the name that you built, and just bring resources to the table, usually capital, but maybe some other talent at the board level, which can provide some additional guidance in areas to where there's some blind spots in the business. So they usually like to leverage that owner's knowledge. And if you have owners that are younger and healthy and hungry and may want to not completely exit the business, but take some chips off the table, maybe they've gotten and grown it to the point and taken all the risks that they really care to take and are ready to take some chips off the table, but then participate in a minority interest and the potential upside of, now I have a partner, I can remove some of these responsibilities from my day-to-day and focus on just growing this business. And then I've got 80% of my equity off the table, and now my financial advisor can diversify that and so on. But there's risk in that. Okay, you roll equity, and it's seen as taboo in some spaces. I think a lot of people read sort of doomsday stories about private equity and how it's hurt things and industries and businesses, but the reality is that it wouldn't exist if they didn't make money. And I don't think it's fair to categorize all private equity as only making money by starving the assets out of the business and leaving it to die, so to speak. And so there were a lot of people that have sold to private equity and done this sort of two-step process and get that second bite of the apple or kick at the can, or whatever metaphor you want to use, and made a lot of money. And so in many cases, they make more money by selling that second minority piece than they did on the majority piece at the beginning. So I would say not all private equity is created equal and should be treated as such. And it's all part of the underwriting process on the seller standpoint and their advisor. Why should we sell to these people? And that's part of what we do, and any real competent advisor would do.
Yeah,
is do
it kind of
that
ties
sort of
back.
due diligence.
Kind of ties back to what you said earlier of finding somebody that matches your ethos, right? Your morals, your values, somebody that you want to do business with, and that could be found in a private equity company as well. So yeah, tell me a little bit about, and our listeners a little bit about some of the internal options for transition.
Right. So most commonly would be transition to key management, transition to family operators, or transition to all the employees, via ESOP. So, generally speaking, I would say of these three, they're not going to equal those top one or two tiers in terms of valuation. ESOPs, they're not going to ever get there. The way that they're primarily financed via bank debt, but also through seller debt, they're very desirable for the employees because it's a very strong tax structure where they get exemption on the S corp taxes, and so, or at least I think the pass through, and so it's very desirable for the employees. For the seller, they're not getting near as much capital at close as they would exploring those other two channels. But maybe the seller has what they need financially. They're not looking for top dollar. They want to leave a legacy. Many other reasons why ESOPs do exist and why they do transact is because there are businesses that really have a very sort of tepid, if not non-existent, secondary market to sell them to. So you see this with a lot of the larger general contractors. Not a lot of buyers out there are buying larger GC firms just because it lacks transferability. It's volatile, it's cyclical, right? There's long payment cycles, very capital intensive in many cases. So if you can't sell into the secondary market, into a strategic or private equity type buyer, sometimes ESOP's your only option to monetize that asset as a seller. And so you see a lot of these larger GC firms have done that. Internally, similar thing, they can be difficult, especially if you're getting out of that smaller SBA 7A program size of 7-8 million. If you're talking about a $15-20 million firm or north, they can be difficult to finance. That's usually a PE type of deal where they're going to come in with the capital, backing the management team, and they can bring the bank debt with them and then give the opportunity for the management to sort of buy in or earn shares and equity in the business. And then family, that word alone should tell you something that can be sometimes very a stressful process. You've got family members who may be in the business or not in the business, or family members that are in the business, but they're not really offering a lot of value. How do you chop that up? How do you finance it as a seller without putting unnecessary burdensome risk on yourself as the seller? What if something goes wrong? You're giving this business to your children or nephews or nieces or whatever, and things go wrong. So the family transition, can be a challenging one. However, there is third-party debt available there. If it's a size where you're talking about, SBA financing is in order, they have very favorable ways for you to get the necessary down payment to the buyers, even if they don't have it. Because most cases, management, whether it's family or not family, they may make a lot of money, relatively speaking, compared to the rest of the population, but they won't have millions of dollars saved up to take these businesses down with a more traditional structure like you would see from, tier one type buyer. So, but sometimes
go ahead.
Confidentiality and discretion are perhaps a little easier to manage through internal and family type transitions, because if you're going to a strategic and you're going to go run a whole auction process, your stuff's just out there. And I don't really care how strong your NDA is and how many teeth it has. I mean, people are just, it's hard to keep that cat in the bag, you know.
Yeah, and families can be tough for sure. Actually, all of them can. None of these are
Yeah.
easy really on the owner. It sounds like a simple process, right? I'm going to sell my business. I'm tired. I'm burnt out. I'm ready. I'm ready for the next phase. I want to do the next thing. You can have good reasons, bad reasons. You can have health reasons. There's all kinds of reasons, but it just seems like, hey, I hire Wes. He sells my business. We'll probably get that done in the next 30 to 60 days, and we'll move on. No, that's not the case. Um, I do work with family businesses, as do you. And I heard one generation tell the other generation, the founding generation, we're not going to let you give us your pile of bad decisions. We want this fixed before you transition it to us. And that's really speaking to people that have a tough time making the hard calls, especially people that have been with them for a very long period of time. But listen, if you could get in the ear of an owner right at that time where they're starting to think about this, right? Hey, maybe 3 to 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, all the pitfalls that these owners see. And one of the things we haven't mentioned yet, which are some shocking statistics, 80% of businesses will never sell, which is kind of mind-boggling, right? If you think people spend all this time and effort and blood, sweat, tears, money, sleepless nights building something that ultimately isn't worth anything and nobody wants, and the family doesn't want it, and you can't sell it, and just kind of quietly closes its doors and fades away. And then of the 20% that do sell, we know that 3/4 of them a year later regret that transaction or some portion of that transaction for a number of reasons. So, when you start to look at it, it's like, oh my gosh, like a couple out of 100 actually have a meaningful transaction where they check all the boxes and they go, wow, this was awesome. If you could get in the air right when that thought's forming, what would you tell them that they need to focus on to get their business ready to sell and to sell well?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, you stole my statistic, but we're both SEPAs, I
We're
guess,
both
in
CEPAs, yeah.
training. So while I'm not a practicing SEPA, I did get certified, and I really glad that I did, and appreciate the curriculum and the program and just the
And for our
entire.
listeners, SEPA is Certified Exit Planning Advisor. Yeah.
Right. And so I would say that right now with the demographic, I read it the other day, it was updated at 12,000 people in the US turn 65 every day. And so
Wow.
how does that translate to this discussion? And I will tell you this, it translates in that this is going to become, and I would argue it is already a buyer's market from an M&A standpoint. Okay, we only hear that it's a selection bias. We only hear about the success stories that so-and-so sold for this multiple, and that multiple, and they made all this money. But as you've noted very aptly and truthfully, 80% of these businesses don't sell. You can go on Biz Buy Sell right now and search for the businesses in sale in Florida, take a screenshot, and then come back 6 months from now, and you're going to see the same businesses because the best ones sell quickly, and it's a buyer's market. So it's all about, I'd say this, you make, I don't know why you can't even see this, but it's a $20 bill, right? A business
Just
makes
send that
$1.
over. I want to make sure it's real. I'll be happy to look at that for you.
So really I like to boil things down to be as simple as possible when I'm explaining a concept. But business owners that I find by and large, and I get this by the way, when they make $1 or they make $5 or they have a good month or have a good year, the inclination is to distribute that money. And the reason is because it's yours and you made it, and after you've paid the bills and the bonuses and what have you. But I think once you start to conceptualize planning and selling the business, you need to think about reinvesting in the business to prepare it for sale. Not just because it makes it a little more valuable, but because the ROI typically will be better than any investment you could ever make.
Yeah.
And so the telltale signs of businesses that aren't prepared to sell they're all throughout the business, and they start right with the website. That's like, combing your hair before you go out on a first date or brushing your teeth.
Wait, what are you
You
saying?
wouldn't.
I don't do that. I don't
Oh,
comb
you're
my hair before I
good.
go on a
You
date.
well, the teeth brushing,
Before
I'm
I take
sure
my
you make
wife
up
out to
for
dinner,
it.
yeah.
And
I might do a
and
little buff or
so
something. Yeah.
I would say with almost 100% certainty, businesses that are ready to sell have beautiful, yet, if anything, simple websites. But you would be shocked at how many don't have any at all. To me, you have to understand from a buyer standpoint, the second that I get that teaser and then I sign that NDA and then I get that pitch deck from the broker, the advisor, the banker, the first thing I'm doing is going to your website. Because I want to find out, forget about the deck for a second. Yes, I want to see the financials in the story, but I want to see where your business is, what this site looks like. Because to me, even if you don't produce $1 of income through the website, it's like the landscaping in the front of your house. Do you take pride in your possessions or do you not? Your business, most of these sellers are going to say, this is my pride and joy, but where's that evidence? Where is that fruit? Where is that manifesting in this business being your pride and joy? It should be in your people. It should be in your financials. It should be in the facilities if you had them. It should be in your retirement plans and the plans and incentives that you have, especially for your key management. What do these things look like in your business? Because what does your equipment look like?
Yeah.
I dealt with a business 2 years ago that was in a landscaping business, and they had trucks that were over 20 years old in this business. So that tells me that you're not maintaining the business in such a way that it really is turnkey and is ready to go.
Yeah.
And so rather than distributing these dollars and taking them, there's tons of ways in which you can reinvest in the business. But for starters, the financials are almost always a problem in lower middle market firms to some degree. And it's understandable why. Most of them were started by the founders, and you can't afford a CFO or financial audits every year. So you start small and you just never really address it. You never really get in front of it and say, all right, we got to deal with this, and get the chart of accounts in order and making sure we're booking from an accrual basis on an accurate, at least somewhat close to GAAP compliant, right? The generally accepted accounting principles. Yeah. So it just becomes problematic when you want to go to market and we're not able to adequately or accurately understand what the business is really making. Because at the end of the day, the buyer is buying the business to secure future cash flows. And if I don't know what the present cash flows are in the past, like how do I really put a value on that? And the answer is, if I do put a value on it, I'm going to discount it because I'm worried that I might overpay and miss something, and due to the accounting of the seller and their procedures. So that would be probably a long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah. So curb appeal, literally and figuratively, right? Curb appeal from a website standpoint, literal curb appeal. If you have a location and a facility, is it well maintained? Is the landscaping done, parking lot clean, building clean, right?
Blocking and tackling.
Well maintained, yeah, just basic stuff.
Right.
Finances, making sure that those are clean. Now, one of the things that does come up is people treating their business like their checking account, where they're running personal stuff through the business. And we know we all want to minimize the tax bill that we pay, right? So we want to minimize, and on one hand, minimize profit. We want to maximize profit, but minimize from a tax perspective. Mm-hmm. But when you go to sell the business, that creates some significant problems when people start looking at the finances. So what do you recommend a business owner does to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the adage that I would use for starters is you can't have your cake and eat it too. Mm-hmm. Buyers hate seeing that personal expenses through the business. And it's almost to them, based on, by the way, not my opinion, thousands of reactions that I get from talking to buyers on an everyday basis. It's insulting to them in a way. It's like, so you've got your kids, vehicle on payroll. They don't work in the business, paying for all their fuel, meals, and entertainment. Why should I accept that as an add back to your earnings? And meanwhile, that's reducing your tax burden. I think that it's bad optics too. It means that you're not really treating your business seriously like a business and you're attempting to really grow it from a valuation standpoint. It tells me that it's a lifestyle business.
Yeah.
And that is not a good moniker to have for your business. And I'll just say, just in terms of the practical applications of that, I've seen circumstances and cases where banks don't accept those as add backs. And if a deal is not financeable or it negatively affects the ability to finance it, just economics, pure economics and finance will tell you it's worth less. There are less buyers, it is less financeable. You know, you remember in 2007 when the mortgage market fell out, what did that do to home prices? There were really only cash buyers out there buying, right? And how many people can afford to buy homes with cash? A small percentage of the overall market of what would otherwise be, you know, home buyers in the traditional sense. So it's bad optics for starters. It's bad math too. If you did the math, I actually have an analysis I won't pull up here, but I did an analysis the other day on a business owner running $100,000 through a business over a 3-year period. And if you call it an S Corp, right, then it would just be the pass-through K1 sort of savings versus not running that through. And at the end, selling it for a 4 or 5 or 6 multiple, and the difference between, you know, what the seller saved in that case and what they lost on the sale of the business, it's a massive 3, 4, 5x. So it really just, especially as you get closer, you need to cut all of that out. It's just better optics for the seller. Buyers are going to see it better. It's going to be a more financeable deal. And it just, for every reason imaginable, you really want to eliminate using your business as your personal piggy bank.
Yeah, and that's such a great perspective. I think people forget that, right? It's the penny wise, dollar foolish kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, I'm saving a few dollars in near-term taxes, but I'm forgoing long-term value on my business, which is worth so much more because of that multiple on the money.
And you have to realize too that when a buyer's looking at that, they don't have a way of knowing if many of these expenses are legitimate or not. There are many legitimate expenses that would be, you know, add back sort of able or eligible, you know, vehicle, fuel, stuff like that. You know, those are fine. The seller compensation, whether it's excess or, you know, depending on the size of the business, whether the seller comp can be added back or not, which is another subject. But so some of these things are defensible. But you start talking about meals and entertainment and vacations and travel that can really add up. As a buyer, if there's any skepticism at all, they could say, well, how do I know that wasn't you treating some vendor or some customer or, you know, some employee to some weekend in Hawaii, or that wasn't a company conference or whatever? Because the reality is, buyers know this, especially if they're savvy. There are sellers that will lie about these things. So they have a responsibility to their management and to their investors to verify everything.
Yeah.
So if you don't really have a compelling case for that add back, you really shouldn't be running those expenses through the business. And we had a case, you know, 4 years ago where we were trying to sell a business for a seller, and we took stacks of these receipts and spreadsheets of add backs, and the bank said, we're not doing this. We're not taking any of these for reasons which I told you. But then the other reason was, we're not going through all these receipts for $42. I mean, these people ran everything through the business. And so what ultimately happened is the seller sold the business and financed 100% of it to the buyer because the deal was unfinanceable.
Yeah, which is high risk to the owner too, right? You take on that
all
debt.
The risk. He's taking all the risk.
Yeah. Yep. So what about, so we talked about just that curb appeal. We talked about the just having clean financials and just doing those properly, you know, having a good CPA, at least giving you good reports, you know, whether you get them audited or not, but having good financial statements, knowing the state of your business is just wise as a business owner. What about like over-reliance on key employees, or if somebody's going to buy the company, how do you know these people are going to stay? You know, how can they do something with that, you know?
It is an increasingly critical issue, I think, for a couple of reasons. But the first reason is we've had, for the most part, a pretty unprecedented run of growth. right? And a low unemployment, which means talent is it is not just, there's not a lot of it out there and available on the streets. And so if you are a seller and if you've built your business well enough to where it doesn't depend on you for the day-to-day operations, which in and of itself is a good thing, that means you've built and brought in talent, right? And the larger that you are, the more talent you have, presumably.
Yeah.
And so most of those people know that they're valuable and they want to be valued. They want to go somewhere to work, especially the younger generation. They want work-life balance. They want to feel appreciated. They want to feel like they're part of something that's, sort of fits their value system. And so I just think that sellers in many cases have done a good job of bringing in good talent and sort of taking care of them, but they haven't found any way to keep them sort of tied to the business. And that involves that $20 bill I just showed you. There's an investment there.
Yeah.
There's many different ways to do that. And part of having a great team, right, is having a great financial advisor and an insurance advisor, where utilizing the proper tools to keep those employees tied to the business and incentivized to stay. And I think one big important facet of that people miss is that different people are motivated by different things. It's not always just about the money. Some people value security more. Some people value equity. Some people don't value equity at all. I want cash now.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're going through your mind and saying, I want to keep these people here, I'm going to put together this plan because of things that you value, you're not asking the right questions. And so I've seen so many cases of this where, I just presented this thing to him or her and she wasn't really interested. And I said, well, did you ask her what was important to her? I guess not. That's not a good point. And then you go back and go, she doesn't want any equity at all. Some people don't understand equity.
Yeah.
And or at least they see it as something too far off in the distance that would benefit them. I have needs now. I have kids in school now. I have these things, and so there's not a one size fits all approach. But one thing I will tell you, if you don't plan, you could really get hurt in the sale process as you're transitioning and you get farther along down that road and you find a buyer. Ultimately, the buyer's going to want to meet with those people.
Yeah. Yep.
It's going to happen. And a buyer that doesn't want to do that, we advisors could say, no, we're not going to let you meet with these people or talk to any of the customers until closing. Okay. I want a pony too for Christmas, but I've never gotten one. And so the reality is the buyer, they see that as a crucial and important part of the company. So you've got to find a way at some point, you're going to have to allow that. Not with every employee necessarily. Every deal is totally different, but they're going to want to talk to some people and make sure that they stay. So you better have some pretty sound advice and a pretty pinpoint strategy as to how you convey that message and the tools that you have to keep them to stay. Because once you tell them, then that cat's out of the bag, and you can't make anybody stay and work somewhere. I mean, that seems overly obvious, but people think, well, you contract and non-compete, like you can't make people work. So you better have a very sound strategy before you go to market. And if you don't, it could backfire on you in a big way.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And that's my world, right? I'm working with owners all the time to build a valuable business, which means having a great culture, having the right people on the team. An owner might hear something like that and say, well, then I shouldn't put all this trust and responsibility on people if they're going to leave. But that totally diminishes the value of your business. And now your business is worth nothing because you are the business. And that'll kill a deal as fast as anything. Because if you leave as the owner, there is no business. So if you're going to be a value creator, you have to have a great team. You have to have a great culture. You have to invest in training and developing, making sure the right people are in the right seats, doing the right thing, right, the right way, that align with culture and are delivering value to a wide range of customers. I heard someone say one time, Craig, what if I spend all this money training all these people and they leave? It's like, wow. What if you don't and they stay? That's even worse. You don't want.
That's always a conundrum.
It is, right? So invest in your people. Leadership first. I'm a firm believer. I buy into John Maxwell's everything rises and falls on leadership. I just see it over and over and over again every time I'm in with a business. So, as we kind of start to wrap this up, one of the things that I have heard and do here is, Craig, why do I need a broker? Why do I need an M&A advisor? I've already got a buyer. I've already got somebody interested in the business. I got a phone call. They want to come take a look at it. I've already got them in the bag. Why do I need somebody? And, most business owners sell their business once or doing it for the first time. And many buyers, they're pretty sophisticated buyers. They've done this a few times. And, they know that there's a naivete to the seller, right? I'm not saying the sellers aren't smart. These are super smart people that have built great companies. But when it comes to selling a business, they can be unsophisticated. So just walk through some of the ways that a sophisticated buyer, some more ethically driven than others, but what are some of the ways they really maybe unfairly take advantage of a seller, and how can a firm like yours help them avoid those things?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'll say you don't even have to start by taking my word for it. There's some pretty strong research out there by University of Alabama that demonstrates that sellers who sell without an advisor sell at substantial discounts to those that do. And the interesting part about that story on top of it was that the sellers that chose not to go this route almost overwhelmingly had sold a business before.
Wow.
So they actually had experience selling, versus the ones that hired an advisor, by and large, had not sold a business before. So the reality is that the environment where the companies that are active in making acquisitions, most of them have done it before. Because you find in the private capital markets especially, most businesses are out there that aren't acquisitive. They just don't think that way. They're not built that way. They don't, if you've got to pay a multiple of earnings, they think it's too risky. But the ones that are savvy. They're out there, they're approaching businesses that are not being offered for sale or not running a market process, because they know it's almost unspoken rule and understood in the industry that they will buy at discounts because they have all the knowledge. Private capital markets are shrouded in mystery, meaning that you can't just go out and find comps of any company out there like you would for a stock that you buy and sell on a daily basis. It's right there. They have to disclose what they've sold for. There's bids and there's asks. With private companies, they don't have that. So buyers that are acquisitive in the space, they have, some of them, the larger ones, have entire phone rooms of associates just pounding the phones looking for business owners all around the US who will sell that are not for sale. And they do that because they have all the chips. They know what the market comps are. They know what they're paying for businesses. They know what to look for. And if you're not what they want, they're just gone. There's somebody else. They're right after them that they can get on the phone with and try to structure those deals with. So that's the first thing. Sellers are really operating in an information vacuum. And if they don't hire an advisor, they really have no understanding or bearing whatsoever on what the market is and what's normal, what's not.
But what about my buddy who is in the same industry, and we were at the country club and he told me that he got 6 times earnings for his business. So obviously that's what I'm going to get, right?
And that's so dangerous too, because people use multiples in terms like EBITDA and what have you, and oftentimes they're not talking about the same thing. And even if they are, your buddy's business might have been a lot larger, it might have been a lot smaller. The management team may have been way better. They may have had IP that you didn't have. I mean, there's so many things that when you go down the list could make his business so much different than yours. And so, really the advisor evens that playing field, even if there's already a buyer, because there's so many other things that we do. But to further drill down and answer your question, and for buyers, it isn't even a matter of moral or ethics. I think it's just part of the game. I mean, we're all grown men and women exchanging in a marketplace and dealing in a marketplace. If the seller doesn't have an advisor and hire an advisor because they think that they're saving a few percentage points or basis points, like that's on them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's not up to the buyer to babysit the seller and tell them, well, you really should hire an investment banker, an M&A advisor. And even so, in some cases, they actually do that because they know that advisors are going to bring some professionalism to the process and increase the chances that they close, because sellers become skeptical down the road because they're dealing with things they don't really understand, and they exacerbate it oftentimes by hiring the wrong attorney that is not an M&A attorney. So it's really, if you think about it, what's the difference between, other than size and valuation, okay? What is the difference between a $500 million or $1 billion company and a $10 million company when it comes to the C-suite or the advisory team? As an absolute given, the $1 billion company is going to have a CEO, a CFO, a COO, now a chief technical officer, marketing officer. They're going to have very highly educated people that bring a lot of expertise to the table. The $10 million business owner, now you can't have all that firepower in your C-suite, right? But you can have advisors that have specialties in the areas that you need to help you through that process. And many of them choose not to do it because, I quote, I already have a buyer. Why would I need an advisor?
Yeah.
I was playing golf 2 years ago, Craig, with a guy who had a hat on. I had met him once before, so I knew his name. We were a little friendly. And I could tell it was his company. And I started asking him about it. And he said, yeah, I just sold it. And this is a guy in his mid to late 60s. And I said, oh, really? How did that go? How did it come by? He said, well, it was a company out of New York. They called me. It wasn't for sale, but kind of threw a price out. It sounded appealing. And I asked him, I wasn't going to dig in and make it all about business because we were playing golf. And I said, did you have an advisor? Oh, no, I had a guy at the club that sold his business a few years ago. He helped me out. By the ninth hole, this man was almost in tears crying to me about how he regretted selling the business because, to answer your question and wrap it all up, in this case, it was working capital. So what is that? Yeah. When buyers buy businesses, especially the larger the businesses they are, they'll pay a price and typically a multiple of earnings, 4, 5, 6, sometimes, well north of that, depending on the industry. But in that, the sellers get to typically keep their cash. They have to pay off any debt, cash-free, debt-free. But the buyer is expecting them to leave some amount of working capital into the business when they close, so they don't have to inject more capital and pay more for it. Well, how much is that, right? What's that number? Well, it's not entirely easy to figure out. Usually it involves, pulling together a lot of the balance sheets, and even still, maybe that's not enough because the seller doesn't keep track of AR or AP that well. So you got to kind of really massage the numbers and dig deep to get that. Well, buyers are very privy to this. They're very sophisticated. So they could say, we need you to leave $400,000 in working capital, where we're going to have a true up period, 90 months or 90 days or 120 days down the road. And there's a whole process to where we go through the true up. And in this case, which is not uncommon, unfortunately, the buyers reached out and said, we did the true ups, and our accounting firm says you owe us another $400,000 in working capital, which, by the way, was 4% of the purchase price.
Wow.
So that's the average fee alone for a deal of that size for an M&A advisor. So you could have hired one, and that likely would have never happened, because we do very extensive analysis on working capital, and it's a big part of the negotiations. Usually it takes place a little before closing, not so much at the beginning. But there's just, if you ask ChatGPT how many deal points there are in a typical M&A deal, they're going to tell you between 100 and 200. Purchase price and valuation is just the tip of the iceberg there. Yeah. Although it's an important tip, there are so many things these owners, they don't know what they don't know. And I think that it's very short-sighted to think that just because you have a buyer that you don't need an advisor. The reality is, if you said to me tomorrow, Wes, I have a buyer for my business, I like them, their initial offer was pretty good, I would like to work something out, I'd say, sure. What's your fee? Well, let's talk about it. My fee's not going to be the same as if I have to run a whole process and go out to market. I mean, it will be, consummate the scope of work that we're doing here. So it shouldn't even get in the way at the end of the day. But if the buyer stutter steps, then we can always go and say, hey, maybe we'll make a few phone calls.
Yep.
Let's see,
Yep.
if somebody else really wants this business, and at least create some accountability and a backup plan. And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of different ways you can take that.
One thing I don't want to leave with and leave without touching on, and you kind of you laid the groundwork for it, where you talked about there's hundreds of points, right? And one of the things that uh, can just it's a gut punch to an owner, like that horrible feeling you get. Like, I think I'm gonna just go off in the corner and maybe throw up here. Just give me a second. Is retrading. So talk a little bit about retrading and what that is, and why do buyers do that, and how can sellers protect themselves?
Right, so retrading is a term that's used for renegotiating a deal after initial terms had already been agreed to, right? So typically you see this most when a buyer and a seller sign a letter of intent with an exclusivity period where the seller's not allowed to talk to anybody during that time. And then the buyer starts doing their due diligence, right? They request all more documents, and some of that diligence is financial, some of it's legal, some of it's other. And then you get some point of the way through diligence, and sometimes it's the very end of the diligence period, whether it's 60 days or 90 days. And the buyer goes, this deal isn't what I expected it to be for whatever reason. We're looking to renegotiate, or we're going to walk. And retrade, and rightfully so, is sort of a four-letter term in the industry. Sellers are definitely afraid of it. Advisors, certainly, we do everything to steer clear of those types of things. But there's just so many things that could lead to that. It could be as simple as an unscrupulous buyer that had planned it all along and just wants to get you locked up and, for lack of a better metaphor, pregnant with the deal, and just tire you out and beat you down, which usually is the most commonly seen in deals where there is not an advisor.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a single buyer, and we're just going to tie you up and just keep requesting doc. Oh, it's another month. We need updated financials, and then by the end, the seller's like, okay, go away, or I'm so tired, fine, we'll take the discount for however many $1 million in close. So as an advisor, we're keenly aware of this, because anytime there's a retrade, it would oftentimes be a reflection on us whether it was our fault or not. So there is a number of ways to combat this. One of the ways to do that is to have the seller, and I could pull out the $20 again, and commission their own quality of earnings report, which is essentially an audit on the profit and loss statement, right? Because the buyer's going to do that anyway. Mm-hmm. With a deal of any size. Well, rather than depend on the buyer's third-party accounting firm to do that, and depend on whatever their findings are, we're going to do that. Because the reality is, almost every seller we deal with in the lower middle market does not have GAAP compliant financials. So they're going to be off of that to some degree. It might be a little, it might be a lot. And some of that depends on the industry and difficulty in accounting for, accrual and work in progress and such. But we had a case now where we suspected, we weren't clear on what the earnings were, could be higher, could be lower. Why don't we commission a Q of E? And so our sellers did that, and it cost approximately $75,000, which was appropriate for the size of the firm. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, EBITDA was almost 10% higher for 2024, and 30% higher for the trailing 12 months. Wow. So think about it this way.
That's huge impact.
Huge impact. So had it have been lower, we would have dealt with it. Maybe we would have gone back and had them grow the business a little bit more because the trajectory was strong. Or in this case, we have a situation where the LOI is tied to a multiple of earnings, and now we're going to get more money in the millions of dollars. So take $4 million and divide that by 75,000 and tell me what that ROI is. Yeah. Now, conversely, if the buyer does it and you wait for diligence and the buyer writes the check, if it comes in higher, guess what?
Yeah, they're sticking with their original number.
Yeah, or you'll just never know.
Yeah.
That is their proprietary document that they have. They might just say, yeah, okay, the QV came in good. They may try to retrade you anyway as a result, just because they know they can try, and there's no sort of no downside in asking for it. But in this case, we took matters in our own hands, and our clients were bold enough to write that check, and it's going to pay off with a massive ROI.
Yeah.
So, there are all kinds of things, and every deal is a little different. So it probably sounds like a sales pitch, but I believe this in my heart, that having the right advisor involved is going to help lead you zigzag through the glaciers a lot easier than not having one.
Yeah, absolutely. And you and I are on the same page there, right? We believe strongly that owners should have, in my case, I believe a strong business coach. In your case, a great sell side M&A advisor. But who else do they need on the team just to make sure that they're showing up with the right team sitting across the table from these sophisticated buyers who are trying to maybe get a good deal?
Yeah, so I mentioned the C-suite before. I see it the same way. I think for business owners in the lower middle market or even small business owners, you're not going to have these people on your staff, but there is tons of valuable advisors and talent that you can have on an as-needed basis, on whether it be hourly, on small retainers or what have you. I think that a big one right now that people are very much underestimating is the accountant. And the best research tool that I've been using recently is Perplexity. They're best at research because they cite their sources very well. It's more than 2/3 of accountants are going to retire in the next 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
And even those, a lot of them don't really have substantive M&A or transaction experience. So it's really critical that you have an accountant that can help you through this process. If you're a business that's going to stick around for a while, you might want to consider making sure that there's a succession plan there with your accountant. And it may be that you keep the accountant, but you need another member of the team to help with the M&A transaction process and making sure that financials are in order, right? So have them reviewed. I would even have them audited sooner than later. So the accountant is massive right now. A lot of clients I've been talking to recently talk about their accountants going into sort of semi-retirement, and a lot of them don't have an exit plan because they're one-off practitioners, so it's problematic. They're not getting, like a lawyer would be typically at a larger firm, they're not getting passed off to, the successor or what have you. So this is something that needs to be dealt with by many business owners. A SEPA, I think, is invaluable to help ensure that the business is ready to sell and is transition ready, and that those three legs of the stool are all addressed, because all of them are important. A lot of them don't even know what they're going to do after retirement. That's an important discussion to be had. Another one is, when the time is right, an M&A lawyer. Don't hire your general counsel, your life estate attorney. We had a client once hire an immigration attorney to represent them in the M&A process. This is a big no-no.
Yeah.
It's no different than a doctor, and you need a stent put in your heart. You're not going to the knee surgeon. You're going to a cardiologist, and you're going to probably interview a few if you have more than a few hours, to decide who's going to do that. So a lawyer is no different. They spend all their time typically in one area or maybe two areas that are related. If you're hiring a lawyer that doesn't have transactional experience, you're making a big mistake. So there's plenty of them out there to choose from. Most of them don't even have to be local. Financial advisor, insurance advisor, estate planner. Are your affairs in order?
Yeah.
And one thing we talk about is, do you have a disaster plan? Do you have a growth plan? Do you have an exit plan? Business owners need to have all three of those things, because at any given moment, if somebody tells you, you say, how do you make your sales and get your business? It's by referral and word of mouth. That's not a growth plan.
Yeah.
To me, that's a lifestyle business. That's somebody that's not willing to invest in a sales team. And it's not going to look well, because that's going to be one of the first things the buyers focus on. How do you make sales? How do you grow? What's the growth plan? I don't want a coupon. I want something that's a platform that's built to where I can grow it. And what happens if something wipes you out tomorrow on the way to work? Do your employees know what to do? Does your wife know what to do? Do your husband, or whoever's running this business or should be running it? And then what's your exit plan?
Yeah.
All of those things will address those advisors that you need in that circle. That's your own small business, medium-sized business C-suite.
Yeah, I love that. I love those three: the disaster plan, the growth plan, and the exit plan. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, thank you. So
Yeah.
Wes, if somebody's out there, they stumble across this and they listen to it and they're like, oh my gosh, I need to talk to Wes. How can they get a hold of you?
Yeah, sure. My email is Wes, W-E-S, at SM2Advisors.com. You can see the SM2 behind me. We have my podcast is Like a Champion. It can be found on YouTube or all the major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And yeah, that's how you get me.
Awesome. We'll make sure we put that in the show notes. So yeah, thank you very much for taking time to talk about some very important topics for our listeners. I really appreciate you being on, Wes.
Thanks for having me, Craig. I enjoy what I do, and it was great chatting with you as always.
Have a great day.
You too.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Summit Series. Please make sure to click on the follow button on your podcast app so you never miss an episode of our show. This episode was produced by Paige King and it was edited by Matt Huston. I'm Craig Huston, and you've been listening to the Summit Series.